having human conversations.
Hello, welcome back. My name is Chelsea,
And my name is Melanie.
and as you just heard, this is our season 2 of Human Conversations. We have our really cool intro. Thanks to my friends Emmanuel and Daniel Christoph. Please feel free to check out Email. That's Emmanuel's band, Emael. My friends were really cool and nice enough to kind of get us a little jingle there. So please feel free to look at them on Instagram and support them as well. Melanie, you want to go ahead and intro what we're going to be talking about today?
Yes, so we're going to start off season 2 talking about independence in this time when we are very much interdependent, and kind of exploring how many of us, especially millennials and young adults, are navigating kind of retaining and honoring our independence while living with family during this COVID time.
Such a big topic, right? It's very relevant for a lot of us.
Yes. So, just watching the news, I saw that 52% of young adults are currently living with parents due to various reasons, a lot of it mostly financial. So that's a large percent of us who are currently living with family, which can cause different emotions to arise in people and different situations to happen. But I thought just kind of exploring that first, kind of talking about the difference between like what independence looks like maybe in collectivist cultures versus individualistic cultures.
Yeah, so I want to put a disclaimer. We're going to be talking about the importance of this separateness with togetherness and honoring the intersectionality of the different aspects of how we come together with our ethnicities, our cultures, our ableism, all of those things that play into who we are. Okay, so you want to take it away?
Yeah, so let's just talk about how independence looks like, I guess, in collectivist cultures. So usually there is a large family presence and support network, and people rely within those networks to survive, right? And survival looks different in different cultures and different families, but it encompasses all things from like just getting a job based on who you know to all the just like having basic needs met, like food and things like that. And in those cultures, it can be seen, like the term independence can be seen as kind of this separating away or this aloneness that isn't really something that they encompass because they rely so much on this kind of network they create.
I like that. I think what's important about that aspect is we, in our Western culture, we tend to think that independence also equals aloneness, but independence can look very different in relationship with another person or in relationship with the system.
Yes. So individualistic kind of ideas of independence, I think, is very promoted in the American culture in the sense of like when you have reached independence, it means it's a good thing. Usually it means you've like reached a certain maybe financial status or reached a certain point in life. It's kind of a marker of your success, I feel like, in more individualistic cultures.
Yeah, and it's okay that I like that, the word marker. It's okay that we have those moments because we can celebrate it in a way that's also celebrating each other, right? Because it takes a team to get to. Usually, it takes a team, people behind the scenes, all of the emotional support, the physical support, the financial support, spiritual support that may go into what marker of success that you're experiencing.
And in America, there's always like this concept of the self-made man, but I've definitely heard from successful people who've talked about like that concept. Like, actually, I remember I saw something about Arnold Schwarzenegger. So he is actually an immigrant. Yeah, came to this country, and he actually said like people had told him he was a self-made man, and he would correct them and say like nothing, like I never did anything alone. I always had people who supported me to get to the place where I got. So even though he came independently to this country and worked hard to achieve what he didn't do it alone. And there was support along the way.
Right, and it's okay to need one another. I think that's where we've, as this westernized culture, we've somehow internalized this message that it's not okay, that we need to be alone and be successful, when really it's okay to need each other. It's okay to want to be in relationship with each other and be successful. That's, to me, that's the ultimate goal, or, you know, that's like the ultimate sense of satisfied, like a satisfied person. Because I know I was mentioning to you, Melanie, we're born inside of another human being. So it wouldn't really, it seems counterintuitive to think that we're meant to be just all alone, and meant to be all alone even in the different markers in our life, if that's success, if that's our milestones, if that's development, any of that stuff, you know.
Right, we are born in relation with people. That's what you were saying to me. And you know, we live out our days in relation with people, right? And supporting each other's development should be the ultimate goal, right? We should always be rooting for all of us, you know, supporting each other in our self-growth.
And I think that's also important. We're gonna say more.
Yes. Well, I was just gonna say that, you know, we're gonna kind of in that realm talk a little bit about some ways to maybe work on gaining your independence within your systems right now, because I think it's really important to talk about how during this time we can kind of navigate that a little more.
Yeah, and before you say that, I was thinking about how when we're talking about, so we were talking about collectivist versus individualistic cultures, and I also want to point out the experience of coming from whichever, you know, the spectrum of gender, because I feel like this is a really important piece to this idea of what it means to be independent. I think, so to trickle down and to kind of expand this idea of intersectionality, I think this culture in the United States, some people have gotten attached to this idea of toxic individualism, and they package it up in this empowerment and sell it as feminism, right? When really we might be attaching ourselves to things that aren't aligned with really like what's going on underneath. So
like human nature.
Right.
Because I mean, like, human nature is we're like herds, you know, like we are made to be in community with one another and support, you know, for survival is, you know, we need to be connected with one another. Right.
And I think in terms of the social and political conversations occurring, it's an extremely privileged view to think that we're better off alone, because it's this idea that it's like this idea where we're labeling people as being inherently toxic, when really it's not. Like I told you before in previous conversations, it's not that the people are toxic, it's that their behaviors are toxic. So their lived experience of what they've been exposed to, that's what has created this dynamic of them behaving in a way that's not togetherness, it's separateness, and then it feeds that concept. So people aren't toxic, but maybe what their behaviors as they're presenting in this culture, that might be coming from a place of trauma, coming place from, you know, all of these negative experiences and wounds that might have been the case for that person, right?
It's behaviors and ideas, right? The ideas and the mindset sometimes that gets developed.
Yeah, so it's not that we're responsible for, because I think when I think of the word togetherness, I think of I think sometimes the word boundary comes up for me, because I think, okay, so how do we all coexist while having those boundaries? And so I think it's really important to remember that we're not responsible for helping others heal. We can coexist while those experiences happen, and we certainly can help others, but that's never an expectation that it's our sole responsibility to, you know, to show up and heal that person, or even think we could even have that power. But just that idea of like, it's our responsibility, it's our expectation. And I think it's important to address, just because a lot of times marginalized groups, marginalized genders, they're also, excuse me, they're oftentimes put in a position where they're expected to be the ones to do that for themselves, right? And, you know, does that make sense?
I think so. So you're saying about like expectations on people in marginalized groups?
Yeah, so like them sacrificing their own well-being in order for this like mutual gain and growth, because
Mm-hmm.
they're already oppressed in these systems. Does that make sense?
So for survival, is that kind of what you're
Right.
talking about? Mm-hmm.
Exactly, yeah. So I just think it's important, because in today's culture, and then what's always been lying underneath of our, you know, the underlying of our society here is that concept of, you know, we are living within these oppressed, these literally innate oppressed systems that have been created. So I just thought that was like something that came to mind when it comes to the marginalization of people and privilege.
Yeah, and how that might impact independence, right?
Right. Because instead of viewing relationships as this container where we can be healed and where we can actually navigate life through these relationships, I think our United States culture has really viewed relationships as transactional, which kind of inherently might come from that colonial mindset, you know, like that colonialized, this is how you do relationships, because in that sense, they're the privileged voice, right? They're the privileged narrative. So I think we move away from that idea, like, no, this is a systemic society. We are all living in relation to one another.
Mm. Yeah, so I think it's important to talk about how, now that we want to set those boundaries, right? So talk about different ways to gain that independence, and how, you know, these kinds of things can be helpful in changing how you navigate your relationships, basically. So I found this article by Crystal Quiden, and this person talked about various ideas for ways to help in your own path towards independence. So one of the things they talked about was spending some time reflecting upon yourself. I think that's really important to look at what, you know, how you've grown to now, and then thinking about like how do you want to continue to grow, and what kinds of things do you want to focus on in your own self-growth, and, you know, where has your life path taken you based on decisions you've made, you know, choices you've made, people who've been in your life. Those different kinds of things I think are good to spend some time reflecting upon. And that's important because for you to feel independent, I feel like you have to kind of know about yourself. You know, you need to know like where you came from, where you want to go, in order to incite that kind of narrative of independence moving forward.
Yeah, I like that.
Along those lines, it's also important to think about your personality. So spending some time getting to know yourself, essentially. Like, you know, maybe your personality isn't one necessarily where you're super outspoken. Maybe you're not an extrovert or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be independent. And I think a lot of times people get that confused too, like the different words people associate with independence. So just knowing though what are parts of my personality, what type of person, like doing maybe one of those like personality tests, etc., to try to get a little more information about yourself and like kind of where you fall in regards to personality. Obviously those are not completely like, those are just more to get an idea. So obviously your personality can change a little bit over time. Some factors aren't necessarily as easy to change, but parts of our personality can be shifted from life experience, trauma, different things like that.
And even healing, right? Like positive experience,
Yes,
a personality
healing.
can heal. Is that the same one as highlighting our weaknesses and strengths, or I like to call them our like our improvements, not our weaknesses?
That is another one. So know your strengths and weaknesses and play to them. So what did you want to add about that, Chelsea?
Yeah, when we were talking about this, I really liked that, because in terms of this concept of independence, because sorry, as I said that, I was thinking maybe it's more about this idea of like interdependence and how we anyways. I like the fact that when we can check in with, well, what are areas that have commonly and consistently shown up for me in a relationship, to where I've heard other people say this feedback about me before, and then on top of that, and then what are my strengths, and how can I use both of those to move forward in a situation that might feel uncomfortable, a situation that might feel difficult to move through, or you don't know what to do. I think when we can play off those strengths, play off those bits of feedback, then we can truly stand firmly into what it means to show up for one another. Because I'm thinking, if I can acknowledge where some of my blind spots are, because I know that other people have shared this bit of information with me before, and then I can also honor, well, I am really good at taking accountability, right? Or one of my strengths is listening, or one of my strengths is being positive, or one of my strengths, then I can show up further in that ownership and say, look, I really care about this friendship, and I want to show that. So how can we meet in this conversation and hear each other, whatever the case may be. So that's why I really it takes a lot of practice to get into a space like that, but I also think that if we have conversations about it, it'll start to normalize this idea that we can do this in relationships, no matter what type of relationship it is.
Mm-hmm. It's hard for some people to admit they have weaknesses, because but we are all human and we all have weaknesses, and I think that's part of the path towards independence, is recognizing that you're not perfect and like there are things that you're going to just be better at, and using those things, and then when the areas where you're weaker at, knowing who you can turn to help and supporting those moments or those times where you need support in that area, because that's not one of your strengths, right?
Yeah.
Another important thing is learning to enjoy your alone time. Now, some people struggle with being alone, being on their own, spending time just with themselves in quiet, just meditative space.
The way you're saying it's so funny to me, like alone with your thoughts.
Yeah, some people struggle with that.
I definitely will raise my hand and say it. I for sure 100% have been a person that falls into this category, because I think it's also the way that I've been nurtured in my upbringing as a woman, identified person as a woman, and nurtured in that form, because I think we're taught to be so accommodating, so welcoming, so hospitable.
Mm-hmm.
That when everyone goes away, they go home, we might have this sense of anxiety rise up inside of us, because we're so used to being not only told that we have to be these certain ways, but then being in those positions so often. because we know back from research that people who are nurtured as women tend to have more increased levels of social skills. So they're constantly put in situations and positions where their experiences are exposing them to increase their social skills.
Yeah,
And
this one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah,
Keep
no,
going.
no, that's, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say this, going off what you're saying, like the learning to enjoy alone time is a little bit, there's conflictual thoughts here with regards to independence, because, and the gender does play into that, right? So learning to enjoy alone time, that might be more of something that maybe somebody who's been societally raised as a woman has to learn to do more of than necessarily a male, because males have been maybe socialized to just be more alone more of the time. So they already maybe enjoy their alone time because they are used to it.
Right. That actually
then,
might be a form of safety for them. Yeah.
Yes. And then, but then the idea of independence is that if you're taking it from an individualistic perspective, or even from a collectivist, it's essentially there is this concept of you are going to be on your own some of the time to become independent. Like there are some things you're going to do on your own, which means you're going to be alone essentially some of the time, right? But then there's this pressure about being in relation with people, like having intimate partnerships that is placed on people, where it's like if you're alone, that's like a bad thing. Like you're a loner, then you're an outcast. So it's this very contradictory idea, right?
Which is that whole singlehood theory, right? Like for, if you're single, that means all these supposed negative narratives, right?
And then there's the opposite, more of like the positive narratives now, I think, that are coming into play about being on your own and thriving, and not being shamed for staying single for longer than previous generations may have stayed single.
Right.
But there's a lot more, we could probably go into that.
I know. And I wanted to say, just on a personal note, I think one of the biggest moments that I ever had in terms of my healing was the moment that I could set aside those narratives that I listened to for so long and say, look, I need to, like, speaking to myself internally, I need to start really understanding and feeling in my body what it's like to be with myself. And as soon as I, hit my own version of what it was to be rock bottom, and for me personally, that was in terms of relationships. Everyone's rock bottom looks different and has its own theme to it. But for me, that's what it was. And so the moment that I finally stood in that and then created so much space to be in that, that's when I finally recognized what it meant to be my own best friend, what it meant to really truly pick myself up and become comfortable with sitting with these things that come up when I'm alone. And everyone's version of that's going to look different, because
everybody's different.
Everyone's different. We come from, all of our different backgrounds, but I think that's why the whole concept of boundaries is also so important, is because if we're not honoring our own boundaries, typically in other areas of our life, we're not honoring it for other people. And I think when we lose sight of what it means to have safety, because that's what boundaries can provide so much, and one of those things can be this container of comfortability, safety, or just being able to move around our day. I think that's when for me, I truly felt like, you know what, I'm actually really comfortable with my alone time now. Like it's really providing this space for me to recharge, to get things done, to play, to interact with things I never get to interact with, to maybe, unwind, or just have this like yummy relationship with myself. And as someone who, people assume or has been nurtured to be, this concept of what it means to be a woman, sometimes when you do that, it's viewed as like, oh, whatever that negative narrative is, and I feel like a lot of times it's so sad, because on the flip side of that, for men, imagine the men who want that connection, like, and then they're oftentimes having to be alone, like you said. Imagine the reverse side of that.
Right.
It's wow.
Yeah. Well, shifting a little bit, but still in line with the boundaries. So you're making yourself a priority is important in working towards independence. And that is basically just respecting your boundaries and not overgiving. And this is hard for a lot of people for various reasons. We kind of talked about survival being one of the key reasons, trauma reactions sometimes force us to, because of our reaction to things, just being in survival mode, we sometimes don't respect our own boundaries. So when working towards that, making yourself a priority and honoring your boundaries in ways that you can, where you feel safe doing so, and thinking about like, what are your own wants, needs, and desires, and thinking about maybe your future in that sense. So your wants and desires are great and should be thought about for sure, and journaled about, and maybe having a vision board about those things for yourself. But I think needs are ones that people need to pay a little more attention to, because those are the ones that you want to really make sure you try to achieve for yourself, like to get your needs met. And what are those needs that you want to get met that would make you feel more independent? And that can be in relation, it can be like physical, there's a lot of different things that fall under needs. So thinking about like, what are those, and what do I need in order to feel more independent? Which is a little different than what you want to feel independent,
Right. And sometimes it can be hard to know, to discern, between
The
those. At
difference,
least, yeah. Especially, for me, that's been a part of my process. Sometimes it can be hard, and just sitting with that and practicing that, like letting that feeling of ambiguity, or just this gray feeling of I have no confusion, just sitting with those emotions. A lot of times, if we let the emotion run through us, we get actually used to it, and then we start to realize, okay, this is what I want. Like it just moves past us, and then we move on to something that we understand.
So another big one, which is probably what most people think about with regards to gaining towards independence, is finances. So understanding your finances is really important. It's very practical in regards to your move towards independence. Creating a budget chart, utilizing the tools out there that are definitely free for people to help you try to get, hopefully, your finances in check and catch up on, maybe, but, different. Right now, a lot of people are losing their jobs or have lost their jobs or in between jobs. So there's a lot of strain in the finance department. So kind of sitting and spending some time on that and figuring that out to make room for goals that you want to save up for, and ways to create that and make that happen. Like that's a very practical approach that you can take towards working on creating more independence, perhaps in the way of moving out on your own, if that's what that need is for you. And sometimes that is a need for people because of family environments. So, working on those kinds of things, sitting down and looking at the numbers sometimes is one of the biggest steps you can take towards independence.
Yeah, and I think it can be really hard too during this time when there's so much pressure to do this, do that, or you're supposed, because a lot of times, like, what comes up for me at least is the whole having to grieve the fact that like this time looks different for me, and this was a time where I thought it might look like this, but now it looks like this, and grieving that, because a lot of that for me did have to do with finances and that aspect of life. So it can really wear on what it means to be independent for yourself.
Yes, and that leads me into my next one, which is learning how to forgive yourself for unmet and unrealistic goals.
Oh my goodness, you got
sometimes
me.
We got some unrealistic goals here, and like, we live in California, so we can only really speak from that perspective, but we know here in California, especially Southern California, owning a house at age 25 is not something that most people are ever going to make happen here. That's like maybe I don't know, 5% of the population maybe, and that might even be too much. I think realistically we need to think about what can we literally achieve in this world, and again, with the needs versus the wants and desires, like, yeah, there's sometimes a big gap between those. So forgiving ourselves for not, being millionaires by the time we're 30 is something we definitely need to practice. And just acceptance. And I always include a gratefulness for what we do have.
Yeah, I feel like it's better to say a gratitude practice as opposed to, because I feel like if you say forgiving yourself, it's automatically said like you did something wrong. Which, I mean,
well, most people feel that way though. They feel like they're not where they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Like along with the grieving, right? So, but they're blaming also, feeling down on themselves for not.
And then that also makes me think, if it's basically just more of a unveiling of all the attachments we have with those social narratives that we're being fed. Like you should be here at this age. It's like all of that unveiling. Like, well, why did someone tell me that, and why did I believe it? Well, because those were my caregivers. Like they wanted what's best for me. Okay, well now how can I align that with what's best for me now? So.
And that goes into my next one, which is about changing your vocabulary. So sometimes, like you're saying, these narratives we have made us say statements where we say won't or can't, using words that are should, that really box us in and limit us. And in order for us to gain a sense of independence, we need to change our narratives to things like when I do this, or when this happens. And so, like, for example, if you're at home with your parents and one of your goals is to move out, it's not like, oh, I'm never going to move out, I don't think I can move out. The narrative needs to change in order for you to feel like you have more motivation to make this happen. And things like when I move out next year, even if it doesn't happen next year, it's just the sense of like you have now created this idea, this goal, and you're trying to work towards making this happen, which is going to most likely make it happen more than if you didn't use those narratives.
Yeah, speaking it into existence. I used to always think, oh my gosh, if I say that, then everyone's going to be. I had a lot of fear around what other people how they would think or judge me or what they would say. So I know that there can be some resistance to the whole, that law of attraction, like what you put out there is what you're going to get back. But I think that me having that fear says more about the people I was around than it does about myself.
Right. Sounds like very judgmental, or there's some judgment that might have been happening there.
A lot of criticism.
Yeah.
Well,
there's just one more, and I think this is important. But this is probably the most challenging, I think, in my opinion, step towards independence. And this one is to be assertive. Now, women in this culture, in our culture, have been socialized that if they are assertive, a lot of times they're categorized as aggressive.
Or passive aggressive.
Yes. And then there's a lot of sense of like being assertive means that you are being in some way like manipulative or like
disrespectful.
Yes, especially culturally.
Selfish, yeah.
But when we think about the actual word and what it really means and how it really is respecting your needs and expressing them clearly and working to get those met.
Oh my gosh, this is one of my favorite topics, which I won't go into, but it was something that I taught often in the elementary school that I worked at. I did a lot of assertive, part of some of the social emotional curriculum that we had was a lot of psychoeducation and experiential activities surrounding assertiveness and showing non-verbally and then speaking verbally with our body and our words, passiveness, aggressiveness, assertiveness, and then passive aggressiveness. And what I found, what was the most enlightening experience was not just how the students, what they understood, but how it impacted the teachers. That was the part where I thought, oh wow, because the teachers oftentimes, they would come up to me and say, I never knew that. You know, like they themselves even weren't as clear as what this meant. So it's very important.
Yes. And in order to establish your independence, sometimes you have to be assertive. And it's hard to learn assertiveness on your own. I mean, you can't, of course you can, and you do it through experience, essentially. And like, I just was thinking about like ways that I've become more assertive, and to be honest, I feel like I didn't consider myself very assertive before I moved abroad. So I lived abroad alone for a year. I lived in Wales, and having to be in a culture that was not my own, all on my own. I didn't actually go with the group necessarily. I met people when I got there, but I didn't go with the group. I had to learn to be assertive because I had to survive, and I had to speak up for myself, which I had never done like really previously. I was very quiet child, and like teen, I didn't really, I was very shy, and I didn't really use my voice very often. There's a lot of factors for that.
Yeah, do you think that has anything to do with being from a collectivist culture by nature?
Yes, I was gonna say, I think it has to do a lot with being a Mexican American woman, and so kind of socialized to not speak up. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, so just going to that, living in another culture, just living in another world, basically, it felt like on my own, I had to learn to be more assertive, which definitely shifted my personality a little bit, and helped me immensely in my future after that. So I always recommend people studying abroad if they can, because it's such a great growing experience.
I'm thinking, like, as you say that, I was thinking for people who are in a position where they don't have that privilege to travel the world or whatever. I'm thinking it sounds like there's something to this concept of building assertiveness skills in a situation where you're a bit removed because of the social barriers of the culture versus your culture. So it's as though, you know, you went into Wales thinking, oh, I'm gonna have this experience. And oftentimes you were already naturally, there were these natural social consequences based on your own behavior, but you never took that in a negative way. You thought, oh, this is how this culture is, or this is the experience that I have here, so I need to step up in this way. I wonder if people who, you know, don't get that chance to travel, I wonder if they're able to be in a space where they can put themselves out there, or enter in a different, you know, activity or group, or, you know, craft or whatever it is that they like, but with maybe in a different environment. Maybe they go to a different city or a different group of people, you know. I wonder what that would be like, because you know, it takes a lot of courage and vulnerability and bravery to put yourself in that type of position. But I also think it takes that environment supporting the fact that you're this new kind of person or whatever in that culture. So there has to be a level of understanding, or I want to say safety, but sometimes like we're not always given that. So it's like a fine line, right?
I think it has to do with safety and space. So like a person can be assertive. It's not like they're becoming a new person necessarily. I don't think I'm becoming a new person, but I feel like that part of myself came out more, and once I feel like I became more of an assertive person, it was hard to just not be assertive after that. Because I feel like I recognized my power, so and honored my power, so why, and my voice, so why would I quiet it? But it's because I had the space to do that. And so you can still do that in relation with people. I think it has to do with safety though, finding a person or persons whom you can practice being assertive with, who you know are safe people, and who are gonna honor and respect your action towards assertiveness or setting boundaries,
Yes.
etc.
Yes, and I highly encourage what Melanie is saying, because I kind of did the wrong, I kind of did the opposite in my past, and that can set you up for a bit of, uncomfortable and a little bit of hurts can happen. So I think that part is really essential as practicing, or at least baby steps, right? Like taking those first steps and then seeing, what does my voice actually sound like? I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That was a cool example.
Yes.
All right.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to episode 1 of season 2.
And we hope that you tune in next time. I hope you've enjoyed this human conversations, and ciao for now.
Having human conversation.